Hi, everyone, and welcome back to What Moves You with Jessie. Today, I am extremely honored. Oh, I'm so excited to have one of my most dear, okay, let me put some real thought into this. Somebody who has had an impact on me in this understanding from the very beginning of me kind of on the exploration journey of what happened to me when I had an insight into how we work inside. This colleague slash dear friend slash mentor in her own way without realizing it in my life, Rohini Ross, is one of the most grounded, authentic, honest, kind, lighthearted, and dear humans that I am so lucky to know and be in the orbit of. I have had the opportunity to assist her on a wonderful 8-month program that she had years ago, called the Soul Centered series. That was a huge, I would say, contribution that she got, her and her husband, that she got on its feet in helping to teach and spread this understanding in the world. And that in and of itself was a wonderful thing for me to be able to be a witness to and to learn from. And she has many stories that have impacted me in the way that she has shared from the stage and in our private conversations that I don't think she even realizes. And to that end, her daughter, Shauna Ross, is who I had on a few weeks ago to talk about her neurodivergence and the impact that had on kind of realizing for herself how she worked in her own unique way inside, and how that's been so freeing for her to learn more. And she was a wonderful sharer. Not a surprise, being the daughter of this wonderful human I'm about to have on the podcast. So anyway, all of that being said, that conversation between Ashana, her daughter, and I sparked us getting back in touch after COVID. And when we were chatting, I brought up to her this really significant story of her life that might not be as big to her anymore as it has stayed with me. And I thought, you know what, Rohini, it is time. Everything inside of me was like, I would love to have you on the podcast to share that, and also for you to share kind of your perspective on how you see the world of possibility and what that looks like in your life. So, with all of that being said, Rohini Ross, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. My heart just feels so grateful, and I'm very happy to be here.
I'm so glad. No kicking and screaming on your end?
No, none whatsoever.
Good.
No arm twisting.
Yeah, no arm twisting. Yeah. So good. So Rohini, I did dangle the carrot a little bit about the story that I would love for you to share with everybody, and we'll get into that. But actually, I would first like to hear, everybody in the audience kind of knows how I arrived to the conversation of understanding how our thought and feeling experience works and how it creates our experience of life. So I really I'm actually getting the pull that I would love to hear you share what that looked like for you. How did you come across these principles behind how life works for all of us inside? How did you come across this understanding?
Well, the first time I came across it was in reading the Relationship Handbook by George Pransky. And at the time, Angus and I were falling apart in our relationship. And Steve Chandler recommended that I read the book. And I didn't know that there was sort of a bigger philosophy, deeper wisdom behind it. I took it at more of a practical level at that point in time. And I can't say that this book is the sole source of things, but we were able to work through our challenges and get our relationship back on track, and have continued to do so over the years. But that was our first step in sort of really seeing something different for ourselves in the relationship forum. And then I can't, quite a few years after that, I was looking at coaching programs and I ended up doing Michael Neal's Super Coach Academy. I think it was in 2011. And it wasn't a principles based program at the time, but there was one weekend where George and Linda came for that weekend. And so when I was in that weekend, I noticed how my nervous system settled. I noticed the hopefulness inside of me rise. I just was really impacted and I couldn't put my finger on what had happened. Right? Like it wasn't like, oh, they said this and that made me feel this way. I just dropped into a really nice feeling. And so when I recognized that experience, I'm like, I would like to understand more, experience more of that. And so from that, I then did the an intensive with Linda and Leela Turner, and as the client, as the guinea pig. And when I was there, so you mentioned thought and feeling and the connection. And I think that I had an understanding at that point where my feelings came from, that they're related to me identifying with thoughts. But I had taken that in the direction of, oh, well, that means I need to manage my thinking. That means if I'm suffering, it's because of my thoughts, and I shouldn't be suffering because I shouldn't have those thoughts. So it kind of got a little twisted up inside of me. And so when I went to that intensive, and I remember, I can't remember actually, Linda asked me something like, what do I want to get out of it? What am I there for? And at the time, I wanted to experience less self-consciousness, less insecurity. And what happened was the opposite of what I can't say it's the opposite, but it was something completely different than what I thought I was looking for. So I thought I was looking to have a different experience inside of myself. And what Linda saw and Leela pointed to was that the issue wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't that I was experiencing too much self-consciousness or too much anxiety. That actually was not the problem. The problem was that I thought there was something wrong with me, that I was having those experiences rather than seeing them as normal human experiences that we all have that come and go. I was making a big deal out of them. And so creating a lot of suffering for myself. And so for me, that helped me to see the innate intelligence inside of me and that's inside of all of us, and to be able to trust that flow and recognize that I don't need to manage it. I don't need to try to control it. And I just felt this incredible freedom and ease independent of whatever I was experiencing. So rather than having less of a certain experience that I thought I didn't want, what I got was freedom to be okay no matter what my experience was. And that felt so much better and so doable. Like we can all do that, and we can't control our experiences. I can't manage my thinking in a way that controls my experience, but I can be present and know the truth that I am safe with whatever is arising within me in this moment. And there's no need to resist it. And there's no need to judge myself for having the experience. It doesn't mean anything about who I am. And that all experience is for us and in service to our learning, growth, awakening. And there's wisdom in all of it. So that was sort of when I jumped in the deep end.
Yeah. I am so glad I got the nudge to ask you because I didn't know that.
Oh,
Yes,
well,
very
there you go. Yeah.
I had remembered that it had had a huge impact on your guys' relationship.
Yes. So do you want to hear that part
Yes.
two to that? So I have that experience, and I'm away up in La Conner at the intensive, and Angus is home with our two girls while I'm gone for 4 or 5 days up in the Pacific Northwest. And I come home and I am flying. I'm just like in such an incredibly expanded state of consciousness, just everything's amazing. And he is in a more distressed state of mind, having, feeling overstretched and overburdened and probably resentful even at the time. I don't know. And so when I came home, there was some exchange between us where he said something that was not very kind or nice. And every other time, I mean, if I think pretty much, I can't think of another time. So I think every other time when he had done something like that, said something like that, I immediately experienced emotional suffering, experienced pain. And so, of course, every other time it looked like when he says this, I feel this, he's causing this. And this time I'm so centered, I guess, so grounded, so clear in seeing things that when he said whatever he said, it didn't hurt at all. And I didn't try to not make it hurt. It just didn't hurt because I could see that it was nothing to do with me and that he was really suffering. And so when I didn't react in the way that he was expecting me to react, which would either be to get angry back or to start crying or something along those, get reactive in some way, he then went for another, he went, let's try again. And I still didn't react. And so at that point, he's like, aren't you going to say something? And I think maybe he'd even realized at that point that, he was pretty heated in what was going on with me. And I said to him honestly, and it wasn't, again, it wasn't a technique. I'm not suggesting this is what you say to your partner when they're behaving like a jerk. But I just genuinely said, I can see that, you're struggling. And I felt compassion for him. And I never felt compassion for him previously when he was suffering that way because I was so caught up in my own personal pain, taking it personally, having all of my thinking about how can I be married to a man like this? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with him? Like all kinds of judgments would come up. And none of that was happening in this moment. I was just really kind of seeing what was in that moment, that he was upset and he wasn't himself. And I think that's what I also really saw was that that's not who he really is. Yes, he can behave that way at times, just like I can, but that's not who he is. And so it's like, oh, he's going to come back to himself. It wasn't a big deal for me. And then what he said was that with me not reacting in the way that I would normally react, and him actually being able to feel my compassion in that moment, not from like I said, like, oh, this is a technique, because I think he's used to me going away, learning techniques, coming home and practicing on him. So he's like, what's going on here? But it's like he could feel the genuineness, I think, of I was just being genuine in the moment. It wasn't some psychological thing I was doing. And he said what happened is that he then could feel his own conscience and was able to sort of check himself because he realized, like, yeah, I'm really not okay in this moment. But for me, that was so empowering because every other time when I had taken it personally, I would feel like a victim in that situation. And it was very disempowering. And so oftentimes people get confused when I talk about this because they think like, oh, you're just going to be a doormat. But I felt the absolute opposite of a doormat. I felt invincible because it wasn't hurting. It wasn't a big deal. I knew he was going to come back to himself. He'd get over it. I was fine all along. There wasn't a problem with me. I felt great. And my heart was open and I could be open-hearted with him even when he's not at his best. And I had never been generous in that way. It's sad because people need your open-heartedness the most when they're struggling and when they're suffering. And so the times when Angus would have needed that most from me, those were the times when I wasn't able to give that to him. And so in that moment, it really showed me how my experience was not coming from him, that his behavior was not dictating how I felt, and that it's possible to stay open-hearted even when someone else is in distress. And if I'm not, like, I'm not saying I do that all the time, if I do get upset, if I do get reactive, then I know that's on me. That's not on him. And so it was just such a really transformative moment, I think for both of us, but especially for me to really see the truth that it's not coming from outside of me. And my well being cannot be taken away by his bad mood or his anger or his, selfishness. Whatever I was thinking was impacting my capacity to feel my well being was not impacting at all. And it was everything to do with what I was identifying with in my own mind and my own beliefs and my own misunderstandings. And so it's like, oh, I guess it's up to me to clean up my act, but not from a place of managing, right? This was not me trying to manage my thinking. It was me naturally being in a different state of mind. But what that does is it helped me to then really have more choice. It helped me to become more conscious of when I wasn't clear. And that when I wasn't clear, that's a reflection of me being caught up. And that if I see that, I may not be able to not be caught up immediately, but I can take better care of myself and I can treat myself in a way that is going to help me settle down, that is going to be compassionate toward myself and just be much kinder to myself. So it's very different than judging myself for having thoughts or identifying with certain thoughts. It's really accepting what is and then making choices that are common sense based on what is, but with a fundamental understanding that my well-being is a constant. My experience of it is not a constant, but it doesn't go anywhere and nobody can take that from me. And that when I settle back down, I drop into that space of love and open-heartedness that we all want to experience more of that. So yeah, that I would say transformed our relationship. The relationship handbook gave us a hint, but that was when it's like, oh, it really landed at that point.
Wow. Okay. Way to get us started. This is so, I mean, it's so profound what you're saying, Rohini, because, it's interesting. I remember being at a really, I don't know how I ended up there, but I ended up at a social of sorts or therapist, like at the very beginning of me starting my coaching practice. And how did was that through somebody that you know? It might have been. It might have been somebody I met at your birthday party. Actually,
great.
All roads go back to Rohini.
I love connecting people.
Yeah. Anyway, I ended up in a conversation with somebody who had read the relationship handbook. And something that she was struggling with it was it feels like like she said, I could hear a lot of common sense in it, but I remember that her kind of the chip on her shoulder was that it was a way to essentially be a doormat to your partner's behavior and to stay in something that doesn't feel right, even if it doesn't feel right. And I remember having this conversation, which I'm sure was delivered quite clumsily because this is like 8 years ago. But I remember kind of pointing her to what you're saying around the more you can see that your partner's behavior is a reflection of the storm inside of them, it actually kind of gets you off the hook to be able to hear what's right for you, which might include moving on.
Yes. Yeah, it could. But
what's interesting is that it feels like a lot of the time it doesn't end up there. And it's kind of, I'm not saying it's a prescriptive to stay in something that doesn't feel right, as I know I've heard you say that time and time again in your writings. But it's just so important to recognize that having this understanding, being able to have compassion for your partner when they're caught up, doesn't equal being a doormat to their behavior, but in fact gives you more autonomy and agency over what feels right for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that often, not always, but often when relationships end, they often end from reactivity. And it's not coming from a place of clarity, peace, wisdom, and love. And I just don't trust when decisions are made from reactivity to be the clearest, cleanest decision. And it, when Angus and I work with couples in our intensives, we're really clear with them that we are not attached to an outcome in terms of the relationship. They might want to really stay together. They might think they need to be apart. And we're like, we're not attached to either outcome. Although Angus will say he's a little bit more attached to the couple staying together. He's honest about that.
He's allowed.
but it's like, it's our responsibility as we see it is to help people connect with their own truth, their own wisdom, to be able to have the capacity to be open-hearted with themselves and with each other. And from that vantage point, we trust that they will make the decisions that are in their best interest for their relationship, whether that's staying together or not. And that nothing bad comes from that. That when we experience who we are more fully, deepen in our awareness of what truth is, life flows from there. And our capacity to experience and create changes with that openness in our mind and heart.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. These conversations can be challenging for me sometimes because I love being quiet when something big and impactful is said, but that's not great for a podcast.
Who says that's not great for a podcast?
That's true, Rohini. You said it. Let's take 5 minutes to be silent. God damn it. No, man, something else you said in your sharing. And for the listeners, I am still fully aware I dangled a carrot of a great story and we will have her tell it. So, but I have to say one thing else that you said. I love that you said to know that I have well-being inside of myself. That's the truth of who I am. I might not experience it from time to time, but I know it's there. Mm-hmm. Can you share that? I just love the way you said that. It's so nourishing.
Mm. Well, I think that before I had that experiential awareness, it felt like well-being was elusive and that it would come and go. And I spent a lot of time sort of in my 20s, probably 30s, getting into really low moods and really, again, struggling with that, not just the experience of that, but also judging myself for having the experience, thinking there was something wrong with me because that was my experience. And at those times when I think about it, it was like that well-being felt like it wasn't there, and that all that was there was the sadness, the grief, the pain that I would get caught up in. And it would feel like it was just like sucking me in. And Angus would, try to help, especially when we first met, and, try to snap me out of this. And like, what's the matter? There's nothing, come on, let's go. It's like, life is good. And it really felt like I couldn't get out of it, that there wasn't the capacity. And what I see now is that all that would happen is that I would get so hard on myself about having that experience that I didn't see how I was just judgment, self-judgment, self-judgment, self-judgment. And that was creating a difficult experience for myself because I was just in the loop of it rather than the energy just kind of moving through me and sort of, okay, now I'm back. I would sort of stay in the rumination without even realizing. It was such a blind spot to me. And then sort of keep beating myself up, keep loathing myself. And then wondering like why I wasn't feeling good, or feeling like there was something wrong with me because I wasn't feeling good. And so when I started to see more and more that freedom, right? That there's nothing wrong with a low mood. There's nothing wrong with feeling depressed. There's nothing wrong with feeling sad. There's nothing wrong with feeling grief. There's nothing wrong with feeling anger. Like all of the feelings that I thought were ones that I shouldn't have, that these were just emotional energy moving through me, that was part of the health of my nervous system, that it didn't mean anything about me, then I started to see that, oh yeah, there's this sort of shift in mood where my mood goes up and down. There's this shift in emotional energy that flows through me, and that changes. But I recognized that there was the space within which that was occurring. And I started to feel that safety of recognizing that all of this is changing. And yet there's this within which it's happening that isn't changing. And that's me too. And that felt really good. And then it became so much more comfortable to be with whatever is moving through, because it's not just an sort of, what's the word? I can't think of it, but it's not like there's solid ground. That's not a good way of saying it, but there was something that helped me feel safe, recognizing that that space is me too, that made all of the stuff that happened within that space less important. And that whatever my experience was doesn't change that more infinite space that it's happening within, that there's no harm that can happen to it, is not diminished in any way. And therefore, I'm not diminished in any way. It doesn't mean anything about me. And so that really shifted it in terms of, I didn't really struggle with low moods after that in the way that I did. And again, I see now that it was the resistance through judgment. And again, innocent, right? I didn't feel safe and I felt scared. And that was the best way that I knew how to take care of myself, was to beat myself up, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that was what made sense to me at the time. But then to realize that it's like, oh, I can relax. This human experience is happening. I'm not controlling it, but I can relax and I can trust and know that this isn't who I am. It is an experience that I have.
Wow. Okay. This isn't who I am. This is an experience that I have. That's so stunning. You know, as you were talking, visuals were kind of popping in my mind. And I realized that the way that you were saying, as you were sharing,
Mm-hmm.
it kind of had me recall this feeling of in myself. And I don't know if maybe you could even say if this lands for you at all with your background as well, being in the field of psychology, but with my higher education being psychology, coming from a family of therapists, you know, not only is it the habit of human beings to analyze, but it was positively reinforced, right? In a, you know, well-intentioned from all the corners.
Of course, yeah.
Of course. But I almost felt like, I remember in my 20s, especially when my anxiety was at its highest, it was almost as if I had this sense that I had to keep it all together in order to feel okay and be okay and experience well-being, as you're saying. And that if I let go, I would be dropped into the pits of the doldrums, right? That I'd be in, that would be this, you know, fire pit that I'd be landing in. So I had to work at keeping myself above the fire pit. And what I'm hearing from you is just a wonderful way of articulating my experience, as well as when I realized that when I let go and I stopped working at it, actually what is waiting for me is like a field of flowers.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, I think actually Ashana, oddly enough, I think she said it feels like a hammock to her, but it's like that, you know? Yeah, that feeling of just like held, and it's so positive, and positive, not in a positive thinking way, but just in the, well, I mean, it's ultimately what we experience when we're present, you know, that neutral feeling of, oh, and so, yeah, I just really appreciate everything you're saying. I don't have many more words than that, other than thanks, because it really recalled things for me in a beautiful way. And I think, with all of our clients, as you said, there's an element of, if I don't work at my well-being, it does not exist.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And your realization was stunning, and likely what the people who sit across from us experience as well. But that realization of, oh no, the well-being is me.
Mm-hmm.
And
you can't get it wrong. You can't screw it up.
Literally, you can try real hard.
That's right. They can feel like it, but it's not happening.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, that's magnificent. Okay, my gut's saying let's go here. Okay, so this story that I have told so many people, and I think it's really wonderful that we've teed it up with such the depth that we've been speaking from, so people can feel like this isn't a prescriptive way of manifesting everything. Mm-hmm. I think the way this is unfolded is perfect. Mm. So you shared a story with me very offhandedly once, and it just stuck to me like glue. About your experience living in Los Angeles with a young family and having the desire to buy a home. Mm-hmm. And this was years ago. Mm-hmm. Right? But can you please share with the people what that was like?
I'm feeling self-conscious about my storytelling. See, Angus is the storyteller in our family. Now, comparing myself to him, but I will do my best to do justice to the story. So, Angus and I were living in an apartment with our two girls, and I was trying to remember exactly how long ago this is. I think we lived in this house for 14 years, so it was probably like nearly 20 years ago. I mean, maybe not quite. Anyway, it was a while ago. And we were living in this apartment with our two girls, and I just really wanted to have a home, to raise a family, for our girls to experience that. And the apartment was fine, but I just really, really, really felt like life would be better if we had a house. And so that was kind of, we're figuring out all of these ways to do it. And it was just like so hard. Was not working at that point in time in terms of saving up the money. I don't know if this was part of the story at that point, but we even at one point moved to Canada. We were able to buy a house in Canada, but we were green card holders at the time. And when we sort of, look, I'm Canadian, so it was fine for me, but for Angus, for him to actually move to the house in Canada, he would have had to give up his green card. So it was like,
he's British in America with a green card, right?
So we got the house, but then I don't have a husband, so that doesn't work. So he was like doing back and forth from LA for a while. He said at one point he came up, and I think the girls at that point were like 4 and 2, and I'm like quivering in a corner after he'd been gone. Like, maybe this isn't working so well for you. So we came back to LA, and at that point, his photography career had shifted. Everything had gone digital. The transition didn't go so well for him in terms of his work. And so we were struggling. We were in debt. It was just hard financially. And at some point, I started looking at, getting a coach for myself, and got interested in what helps transformation. How do things change? And one point I had a conversation with Steve Hardison, and it was such an amazing conversation. But one of the things that stands out is he was basically asking me, what did I want to create? What was I wanting to create in the world? What was I yearning for? I don't remember exactly how he asked me. But one of the things that I talked to him about was, I really want to own a home, but we don't have the money for a deposit. We don't have the 20% for a deposit, so we can't buy a home. So I said it's something along those lines. And what was so helpful for me is that when I said we can't buy a home, he didn't act as if that was true. And for him, that was just not true at all. And so he came up with this idea, since we didn't have the deposit to buy a home. He said, well, Rohini, that doesn't mean you can't have a home. And again, I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember exactly how he said it. But he said, what if you just, there's plenty of people that need tax write-offs, And what if you just started asking people if they had a home that they could give you and then they could take the tax write-off for it? And I'm like, what? What is he saying to me? Like, what's happening here? But what was so powerful about that conversation was that in his mind, the possibility of owning a home was 100% real. In my mind, the possibility of owning a home was not a possible solution. That wasn't possible. So my mind was closed to that outcome. His mind was totally open to that outcome. I was like, what's the big deal here? And so that had such a profound impact on me because it helped me see my own bias, my own conditioning, and my own lack of willingness to really fully step into possibility. Now, I didn't do what he said. I don't think I asked one person if they would give me their home. But what he did was he opened my mind, and there was a shift inside of me that was now recognizing that it was a possibility. I might not know how to get there in this moment or in that moment, but it didn't mean it wasn't a possibility. And then there's a second part to this that I do think is important because there was another piece of this. So part of it was being open to the possibility. So one, seeing how I had a closed mind. So in my world, that wasn't a possibility. So that kind of makes sense that it's not happening. But the other piece that I think is also really important is that I really believe that my life would be better if we owned a home. I felt like I needed it. It wasn't a preference. It was like, I need this and I'm not good enough. Like it was a reflection of my value. And we're like, as a good mother, as good parents, we would own a home and be able to provide that for our children. I'm sure there's all kinds of beliefs in there, but something along those lines. And so at this point, this was a little bit later after this conversation, and I had started doing well or better with my work. And so we were putting money aside, but we were working so hard. Angus was working hard, we're putting this money aside, trying to save up, to buy a home. And it was Christmas vacation. And Angus had the week off, and I probably had the week off too. And we just had this conversation where we're just like, we're working too hard. Like, life is for enjoying. Like, what are we doing? This is not feeling good. And I said to him, let's just forget about buying a house. Let's, because he wanted to leave his job. You can leave your job. We'll be fine. You can do what you want to do, which is not this job. And we can just forget about that. And it's like that just sort of freed both of us up from this sort of urgency around achieving that. And we just kind of both fell into let's just enjoy life and we're fine. If our kids grow up in an apartment, like they're fine. They're happy. There's nothing wrong with that. They're good. And so it really shifted that attachment to outcome. And so Angus went back to work. He gave in his notice and, everything was good. And literally a week after he'd done that is when we found the house that we now live in. And it was like, what? And then I think I told you he had to go back and ask for his job back because I wasn't a W-2 employee and he was. And we needed his W-2 to get the mortgage. So he did go back and work there for a little bit. But I think those two parts, like just thinking about this for people in terms of creating and manifesting, like I don't even really know how to talk about it in that language, but I feel like intention is important. Having a heartfelt intention that is a real possibility. Like I didn't have an open mind to owning a home. I had a closed mind, felt like that's not possible. I want it, but it's not possible. But really believing in the possibility, I think, is important. But also for me, not being attached to the outcome, not having my worth be attached to it, having it be, that's nice. And yeah, my heart likes the idea of that, but I'm completely okay with what is as it is. Like those feel related to me. And So that was kind of how I think that's the story, right? Is that all of the
Yes.
story? Yes.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
I was wanting to caveat it when you were like, oh, Angus is the storyteller. I wanted to say, but you're the one I heard it from, and look at how it made an impact. So clearly, okay.
Yeah.
I love that. I love it because, ultimately what kind of gave me the zing about, when I brought it up to you again over coffee, it's just such, I don't know how to talk about manifesting either. That just plopped out of my mouth as I was sharing or as I introed the story. But when it comes to seeing that there is always more possibility than what we, for lack of a better word, see. I need to repeat myself. It's like we can only kind of see a slice, based on all the things that we know and our conditioning and everything, as you're saying. And what I really appreciate that I'm always kind of pointing people to also is the fact that there's so much more that we know nothing about, right? It's kind of like this dear chef that I love following on Instagram, and I get his little newsletter once a week. He was talking about how he planted tulips back in September, or they were planted earlier, then he deadheaded them in September. So now you can't see anything, right? Because they're all just under the dirt, can't see anything. And he was sharing in the newsletter that it's kind of been on the back of his mind, like, oh, I hope that they sprout. I hope they come back. And he was sharing that they have. He's starting to see the teeny tiny green, seedlings pop. And I just thought, what an incredible, September to where we are, March of 2025. In that space, you can just kind of picture that he's out kind of checking on him. Oh, nothing. Like, and of course not. It's winter. And he's like having that conversation with himself. But then at the same time, kind of wondering if it's going to happen. Yeah. And then there it was. And I just couldn't help but to feel like that is such an incredible metaphor for the fact that there's always so much more that we can't see that is absolutely, available to us. And so much more that's happening, especially like in growth when we're not seeing the fireworks in our life or the obvious kind of evidence of change inside of ourselves. We think, oh, it must not be happening. And it's like, there's probably a hell of a lot more happening underneath the surface than you realize. So, the reason why I've always loved that story so much is also the fact, and thank you for sharing both parts, because it is so important that you settled and realized like, oh, this isn't actually a need. This is just a preference. And that's, I can actually be okay with that, is what it is. But I've always loved that he made such kind of an out there suggestion of, get somebody to just give you a house. And what really impacted me as the listener when you first said that to me was, I love that, I think kind of what typically people would kind of get onto is, oh, and so then they think that's the directive. I will go look for wealthy people who have extra houses to give away. And I love that you went, that's not at all what that was. It represented something deeper of, oh my God, I've been kind of living within some confines I didn't even realize.
Yeah. And that was such a great coaching moment where Steve saw the potential that I couldn't see. And in my mind, recognizing, well, if I'm seeing it as impossible, of course it's impossible.
Yeah.
Right. That being able to live in what's real and true, like the construct of not being able to do that was my construct. Truth, reality is as possible. And I was not living in reality. I was living in the construct. And all of this was connected to my feelings of self-worth and unworthiness and all of that stuff. Like all of that conditioning was playing out in this area of my life. And to be able to see that, oh, that's not real. Possibility is actually reality. Potential is reality. can I live in reality and be responsive to that rather than buying into my conditioning and live as if that's the truth when it's not?
Oof. Can you speak to that through the lens of the relationship work that you do with people?
Oh my goodness. Yes. Well, what we often see and what Angus and I experienced in our relationship is that the historical conditioning, the developmental challenges that we experienced that weren't necessarily noticeable in the first few years of our relationship started to show up at some point in our relationship. And we bring the lens of our conditioning into the relationship. And in relationships, it often feels really high stakes that our partner doesn't rub us the wrong way on those things. Like, and we tend to choose people that are absolutely going to touch those vulnerable spots inside of us. And so much of the work that we do is helping people see their conditioning and wake up to the lens that they're looking at their partner through, the lens that they're looking at life through, so that they can have more freedom from it and recognize it for what it is. And I'll speak to it with Angus and me because I can share whatever I want there. In terms of my conditioning, like Angus wears, he's kind of expressive. He wears his heart on his sleeve. And earlier on in our relationship, he was more reactive. Like I mentioned, he was not very kind when I came home from that trip. And I would, my conditioning would have me take that so personally and really feel like I was less than, not seeing like, oh, he struggles and, gets dysregulated. And this is how he, tries to stabilize, not the greatest way. I'm not saying it's a good way, but that's the best that he can do or was able to do at that time. But the way that I took it would have me react in such a way, it would be like putting gasoline on that fire. Like he's already not okay, but then my reaction to him not being okay was like, and so we would have this conflict and it would just, flare up and it would be so painful. And his conditioning, like when he's angry or reactive, like that's him being caught up in his conditioning and feeling hurt, but protecting himself from the hurt through discharging anger. Like I can be angry, I'm not going to be hurt. And then for me to be like, oh, if he's treating me that way, that means I'm unworthy, not good enough. And then blaming him for feeling that way when really I'm the one believing that about myself. And so it just gets all tangled up. And so in relationship, you want to be able to really see what's yours. And I think one of the fundamental understanding that's so important for that is realizing that our emotional suffering does not come from outside of ourselves. And this is where we want to be really clear in terms of what we said earlier about not being a doormat. That does not mean I'm condoning harmful behavior, unkind behavior. I'm not condoning that. But just like my example, Angus wasn't kind. And I felt totally fine in that moment. He was not causing my experience, which it really looked to me like he was responsible for my experience before that. So to be able to see that my experience is a reflection of what I'm identifying with in my own consciousness, and that's the way that I can best take care of myself is through seeing that. And then if I am caught up, being able to take care of myself in a way that allows my nervous system to stabilize, allows me to come back to balance. And I don't get that way through resisting my experience. I get that way through being present to what is arising within me. And that so often there's like the surface feeling, but then there's the more vulnerable feeling underneath it. So I would say anger was kind of the surface feelings for both Angus and myself. He was more explosive with his anger. That sounds strong, but just more, loud with it. I was much, I'd be like cut off, mean, just condescending. Like I had my anger showed up in a different way that made me think it was better than his. Like I felt like I'm not like you, but I was just as mean and in my own way. But that was the surface feeling. And if I went underneath that, there was the hurt, there was the feeling of helplessness, there was a feeling of powerlessness, a feeling of being out of control. But it was harder for me to drop into that because I was more caught up in anger and trying to make him be different so that I could feel okay. And this happens so often. And that's all from conditioning because fundamentally I was okay. And he wasn't taking away my well being from me. And he is an amazing man. And, for that time we were really struggling in our relationship and, nearly didn't stay together through that period, I'm like so grateful that we were able to see each other more clearly because of what we've been able to enjoy and create together in our lives. And our conditioning and our reactivity initially made that really hard. It almost felt impossible. And it really felt like we weren't compatible. Right. And now that sounds crazy. Like he's my favorite person in the world, and my kids, but it's like, oh, so it's like, but that looked so real and true, but that's the conditioning. That's the misunderstanding. That's the thinking that I'm not safe because you're a certain way. And again, this is not anything about physical safety, but emotional safety, not feeling emotionally safe. I can't handle this and realizing, but that's because of my internal system buying into things that aren't true. And that when I'm in the truth of what's here right now, and I feel that space of love, that space of peace, that space of just compassion that is there for all of us, when I'm in that, that's what's real and true. And when I'm able to be in that fundamental reality and respond from that place, it's like, wow, I show up differently. He also shows up differently. And he also had to do his own healing as well. It's not like I did that for him, but as a couple, we're able to be on that journey together and support each other with that. And so that's really, I think, seeing the shifts that we experienced in our relationship that really looked impossible. Like it's common for us to say when we're speaking with couples that, there isn't anything, that you're bringing forward that we haven't been there and experienced and, been married like 33 years now. But it's sort of so, these challenges are so common, but they're really opportunities for our own healing and our own awakening and our own deeper experience of truth that we then get to see life through a clearer lens and enjoy what's actually there and have ourselves be more in alignment with truth. And relationships thrive in that space. And that doesn't mean that there's not learning curves and bumps along the way, but when there's a commitment to that deeper internal experience of what is real and what is alive inside of us, who we are, that exploration has a ripple effect that is just going to impact every area of life, but especially, it seems, the area of relationship.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you for sharing such an intimate part of your life. I really appreciate that. And I know everybody listening does too. Something that is occurring to me is because we've used the word conditioning a lot, and I have also in all of the episodes that I've done here, but for whatever reason, it's actually occurring to me to get your perspective on what it means. So what is the definition of conditioning to you?
Well, I don't know what the formal definition is, but for me, what it means is that we have our meaning that we've created that isn't truth. Mm-hmm. And that we live within that as if it is true. And it looks true. It's kind of like the lens through which we see things, but it's distorted.
Yes. Yes. Great. That's how I feel about it too. What kind of occurs to me is all the conclusions we've drawn about ourselves and about how life works from our experiences.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And they're misunderstandings that are often put together at a really young age. And it looks like that's true, but it's just not true.
Yes. Yes. Well, Christ, it feels like we scratched the surface and we're already at time.
Oh my goodness.
But what I really appreciate about both, kind of subjects that we talked about, the possibilities that you realized about finding a home in the most expensive city on this planet with a young family and budding careers, right? One in transition and one budding years back. That mixed with the freedom and new possibility that you see is true for all relationships, whether it be the one with yourself or the one with your intimate partner, and of course friendships and all the other ones too. But what I really appreciate, if we were to kind of thread the needle here, is just honestly what it comes to mind is what you've called your past programs, the soul-centered series. Essentially coming home to yourself, really getting curious about who you are underneath the noise of your mind and what happens when we come from there.
Yes.
And it just kind of blowing my mind that I'm just now kind of realizing the meaning behind why you would have even called your programs the Soul Centered series.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you find that for yourself and then also for all the folks and relationships that you work with that, let me ask you this. This feels like a nice kind of way to come around. What do you find is kind of the common experience, no matter the outcome of whether they, after they leave you and weeks later and the conversations that unfold from there, no matter what they decide to do with their relationship or their marriage status, independent of that, what do you find is the experience of people in general when they start to wake up to the wholeness of who they are underneath the noise of their mind?
It's just this, I mean, I've used the word open-heartedness a lot. Like there's just this wellspring of love and kindness and generosity and peace within themselves. Like it's just connecting in with that. And kind of the exhale that happens when we drop into, oh, there it is. And trusting that that is the compass point and that the noise, as you're saying, that's on top of all of that is not the compass point, and we don't need to have our behavior driven by that noise. We can actually allow that deeper feeling that knows who we are to be what fuels and inspires us in our actions in life.
Wow, that's fantastic. I'm going to ask you another question after I have you share details of how people can work with you. I'm going to ask you another question where you might feel challenged to say something different because, man, that feels like a wonderful way to end. But before I ask you the final question, how can people find you? Because you just share a little bit about kind of who you love to work with, and then how people can find you.
So Angus and I work with couples doing couples intensives and follow up. And so that's definitely one of my favorite things to do is to support couples in their relationship. And sometimes it's couples that want to deepen in their intimacy. Sometimes it's couples that are really struggling. So there's a whole continuum. And then we were talking with one of our couples yesterday, and he said, are you working with people when they get engaged? You need to work with people when they get engaged. I'm like, yeah, I'd love to work with more people that are getting engaged. So that's hopefully a budding opportunity there. And then also I offer one-on-one coaching and mentoring. So that's available too. And I do intensive in that format as well.
Awesome. And I will make it a clickable link in the show notes, but where can people find more information?
therewilders.org is our website.
Therewilders.org. There we go. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Yes, because that has information for both you and Angus, and then also just you and Angus.
Yes.
For
Yeah.
people.
Everything's there.
Yeah, cool. Which, God, we could have done a whole freaking episode around what rewilders means. I absolutely love. Damn. Well, that's a great reason to come back. Okay. Rohini, thank you
Mhm.
so much for coming on the podcast. I'm so grateful to have had this time and to be able to share such an important person in my life with my
Oh, thank you.
truly. Okay, Rohini Ross, final question. Whatever occurs to you is perfect. What moves you?
Mm. Well, I guess I've got rewilding on my mind now. But it's like allowing ourselves to be rewilded by the love that is our true nature, to deepen our experience of that, our knowing of that, our connection to that, and to live that fully in whatever way inspires us to express that.
And mic drop. Oh, so good. Thank you, Rohini. Thank you so much. And I am absolutely going to be giving you a call, and maybe we'll actually do a little arm twisting and get Angus to join you. So we
Oh,
have.
I'm sure. I don't think his arm would need twisting.
Okay, good. Awesome. Well, thank you.
Jessie. So
Yeah.
great spending time with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad. Me too. Thanks, Rohini. And I'll see you soon.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to What Moves You with Jessie. Let's stay connected. You can find more ideas and strategies on being human on my Instagram, @WhatMovesYouWithJessie. Sign up for my newsletter or learn more about working with me at whatmovesyouwithjessie.com. And please rate and review the show and let us know what you think and what resonated. I read every single review. They mean so much to me. You can also call in on our hotline with your thoughts on what resonated there too. It is always live at 818-646-JESS. That's 818-646-JESS. What Moves You with Jessie is produced by Mike McGraw and Tinker City Music. Now, let's take a deep breath and give ourselves permission to live in this moment for what truly moves you.